What's up, everybody? This is Ryan here, and you're watching another episode of me talking to a piece of plastic with some glass on the front known as a webcam. Thank you for joining me once again. Um, so normally I do lessons on Twitch on Mondays, and I do live streams on Q&As on YouTube on Wednesdays. But I just got back from spending a week in Charlottetown in Prince Edward Island, which is basically the just about the most eastern point of Canada that you can visit. I think technically Newfoundland would be the most eastern point, but yeah, I basically flew from one end of Canada to the other and spent at least the work week there with my team, my current company, and it was a lot of fun. It was a great experience, but I got back very late on Friday night, and didn't really do much of anything over the weekend because I was just exhausted in a good way, but very exhausted. And I did sit down to write a lesson plan yesterday, and I kept thinking like, well, what do I want to talk about? Because normally I'm sort of inspired to talk about something. And I kind of went through my list of things I've already rambled about or tried to think of something new. And then I thought, I just don't feel like teaching tomorrow. So that's why we're doing a Q&A today. So that's the plan. Also, I apologize. I'll probably be sniffling a little bit between having cats and also the wildfire smoke that has blanketed British Columbia, which is the province that I live in. I'll probably be sniffling a little bit. So it is what it is. Anyways, yeah. Until we get some questions, I think I'll just ramble for a minute. I spent 6-ish days in PEI with my team, and that was very fun. So the team I currently work with is mostly remote. So it's quite an old company. They've been around for 24 years, and there was a period where they were in office, and then some members of the team decided to just move across the globe and work quite a bit before remote work was a common thing. And then after COVID, even though they have like two buildings that are offices, just about everybody ended up going remote. So there are a couple people which do hang out in the office during the work week, but it's for the most part a not a fully remote team, but close to it. So it was great to have the experience to fly in. Hey, what's up, Swaminath? Um, it was great to have the experience to actually meet everybody in person, and I also got to have lunches and hang out with people who I wouldn't normally hang out with, like so people in different teams. We've got a number of different clients and different teams, and we tend to, at least daily stand-ups wise, just be with the team that we work with naturally. So it was really great to meet a whole bunch of people. And one thing that has been unique about this company is that in every other company that I've worked with, there's always at least one person who is like at least a little bit toxic or a little bit like evil inside or sociopathic. And at my current company, there's nobody who I can point to that even has a little bit of that. So good hiring policy. So yeah, very very happy overall. It was a great experience, and it was great to meet everybody and make those kind of connections. What's up, Mehmet? Yeah, so anyways, I don't have anything particular to teach. This is Q&A today, so if you have any questions, go ahead and ramble or ask, and actually I'll be doing the rambling. And then if you don't have any questions, then that is no problema, which is Spanish, well, almost Spanish for no problem. And you might be thinking to yourself, a real man wouldn't drink from a cup like this, but I would counter that and say that a real man drinks from whatever kind of cup that he wants to. So yeah, this works best if people ask questions. I'll try and ramble more. What did I do that was fun? We went to the beach in PEI. That was fun. I ate a lot of curry. All right. Mehmet asks, can I ask you a question about Jetpack Compose? You can certainly ask me a question. Whether I will give you a useful answer, I can't guarantee, but go ahead. I'm not an expert with Jetpack Compose. I know the basics of it, so if you have like a basic question, I might be able to help you, but if it's like a really technical performance-based thing, there's a pretty good chance I don't have a good answer for you. My previous company did not use Compose, and my current company almost doesn't use Compose, so it is what it is. But go ahead and ask your question anyways, and if I can't help you, I'll just say that. Swamanath asks, how do you keep your knowledge, like not forgetting things after learning a concept? This is a tricky thing for me because I actually don't have a particularly good memory for certain things. I have a really good memory for some things, and I tend to be able to retain like a big picture understanding of what I learned or learn. It's just the details that tend to lack out of my brain. My sort of experience with this is you have to review the knowledge. A frequency that I was given in a learning course, and I don't know how true this is, but basically the frequency I was given is, suppose you learn a new concept, review the, actually, yeah, let's write it out. Suppose you learn a new concept, review it after 1 week, 1 month, and then 6 months. And if you review it on that kind of a schedule, then apparently the likelihood that you will retain it is the word I'm looking for, is quite high. Now, hopefully it's something you can review because it's part of your daily work. This is ideal. So this would be what you would have to do in the event that your day-to-day work doesn't require you to think about the concept that you learned. Whereas if it's something that you do need to use daily, then that's easier to work with. I think so if it's something that's really important, you might want to consider doing this. And I'm pretty sure there's apps out there that would allow you to schedule these sorts of things. And in a previous live stream, I talked about question and answer notes. Let me just pull up an example here. Where do I put my notes? Study, KTOR. Yeah, so just really quickly, I'm not going to go over the whole thing, but I'm a huge fan of what I call question and answer notes. So as I'm learning something, I will write questions. So if I come across a concept, for example, SSR, server-side rendering, then I'll write a question, whatever I want to know about it, whatever I think is relevant, and I'll phrase the question in my own terms. And then once I'm done the study session, then I'll go back and answer the question. And if I can't answer the question, I'll go back and review. So this would be the kind of document that I would keep where I would come back to, say, a week later, a month later, 6 months later, and I would try and answer these questions. And if I can't answer all these questions, I know some details have leaked out of my brain. Whereas if I can answer them all to a satisfactory level, then I'm happy that I have retained the knowledge. So it's important for a number of reasons, self-testing, and yeah. So that would be the kind of thing I would suggest for you to, how you would approach this kind of thing. I think that's pretty well all I want to say about this question. I guess the last thing I want to say is I don't have a particularly good memory for certain details. So if you feel like you're forgetting things all the time, well, you can at least make it as far as I have done as a programmer. Yeah. Like, great example for me. I'm really bad at remembering syntax. So great example, like if you were to ask me, Ryan, could you write an advanced for loop in Java? The odds that I would get that correct the first time would be very low because I just don't really retain those sorts of very low level details. It's just not how my brain likes to learn things. So, yeah, I guess the answer is sort of like, don't worry too much about it, but here's what I would do if I really had to, if I needed to retain things. You have to, oops, sorry. You have to figure out how your brain works and kind of work with that. What's up, Harish? All right, we got a question from Batre. Hey, Ryan, I have an interview in 2 days. The company treats payments online. Any idea on how to structure a module of payments? So I think what you're asking me here is about the system design of an online payments system. And I would be very in over my head if I were to try and do a systems design interview on payments. What I would suggest you do is look up some online payment API examples and learn why the different fields of the API exist and roughly how they would work. And what I mean here is, and this is more like general advice for systems design, is try to have a model and API in mind. One thing that I know would be really important is like handshaking, I think is the term. Take this with a grain of salt because I'm not an expert in fintech, but handshaking would be like, when it comes to money, it's very, very important that if one server sends money to another, that the money actually gets into the other server, and then the balance in that server is raised, and the balance in the originating server goes down. And my very limited understanding of that process is there's handshaking and probably some kind of transactioning going on, which would allow you to be pretty well absolutely certain that the money has gotten into the account you're sending it to, and then the ability to roll back the transition. So if anything goes wrong, we put the money back into the original account. But as far as like a detailed example, let's see if we can pull something up online. So example financial API. What's this? Well, that's sponsored. Yeah, I don't know if I'll be able to find a good example. Yeah, I don't think I'll be able to find a good example off the top of my head, but yeah, that's really those are kind of the things that I would suggest. But like I say, I'm not an expert in it. But yeah, the main thing I would try to do in a systems design type of interview, and for those who don't know what systems design is or what these kinds of interviews are, generally how it works is one of the people who are interviewing you will give you an example problem. Problems I've had in the past: design a chat messaging API or system. Um, yeah, that's one example. I was going to list another example, and then I remembered that it's covered by an NDA, so I probably shouldn't do that. But yeah, that's generally, it'll be like, Bill, how would you design Twitter? How would you design a banking app? Those those sorts of questions. And one thing to keep in mind, I don't know, Battery, if you're a mobile developer. Oh, okay, you're a mobile developer. One thing that is probably a given is if you're not an expert, if you haven't told the people who you're hiring with that, hey, I have a lot of back-end experience, you shouldn't be expected to answer much in the way of questions about like, um, the design of the back end. Really, like the API boundary is probably what you're going to be. Anything from the API boundary down to the Android client is pretty well what they'll expect you to be an expert in. If they want to be like, how would you design a load balancer for the system? It's kind of like, well, what are you hiring me for? Are you hiring me as a backend uh, infrastructure developer, or am I going to be writing mobile apps? So yeah, hopefully that's useful. How do you has a question which I don't think I can answer very well. I had a question regarding Android Target SDK 33 deadline. Existing app targeting SDK 31 should continue working on 31 and above. Any idea? I don't off the top of my head. No. Okay, so currently existing apps must target API 31 or above by August 31st, 2023. Okay, so what I see that saying is that, yeah, you should continue working on 31 and above. So your target SDK in your Gradle file from August 31st onward, which is only a couple days away, will need to at a minimum support API 31. I actually got a message about this in the Play console. So that's really what that means is you'll have to set it to 31 or higher. And then you'll want to, for sure, like test the core functionality of your application on each of those different API levels. This is one of the few, not few, but this is one situation where using emulators is probably a decent idea unless you just happen to have a whole bunch of test phones. But, oh, they're saying all apps must target 33? Huh. Well. Oh, that's, okay. Huh. Interesting. So it's saying your new apps must target 33 or higher. App updates must target 13 or higher. That's interesting. Yeah. Well, it's not like the large distributed team at Google to ever give conflicting information to developers. So yeah, I don't know. Well, that's a totally different thing. So yeah, who knows? Yeah, interesting. Well, that's fun. I'm gonna move to the next question because yeah, that's just Google being Google. But yeah, so apparently you either need to target API 31 or you need to target 33. It's like an or statement. Yeah. Hey, what's up, Motaz? All right. Learning path for async programming. We would recommend going through earlier Java features / completables, then coroutines, or some more things in between. What I really like, I actually kind of would, if I was to teach this topic, I would suggest the Java. I personally like the Java executors framework. Let me see if I can find an example. So I personally like the executors framework. And why I like it is it's pretty easy to use with Android, and it's a nice balance. I personally find threads are just a little bit lower level than I really like to bother with. whereas executors, it's like one layer of abstraction above that. The key things you would need to know about executors is this is how you create an executor which talks to the main thread via the looper. So this is a fancy way of saying whenever you're using RxJava and you're using Android schedulers.main, or I think in coroutines, what is it? Schedulers dot whatever. I can't remember, but anyways, when you want to talk back to the main thread, you want this thing here. And this is an easy way to set up. You just create this main thread executor, and then you you just follow this code example here, basically. And you can obviously do this in Kotlin. And then the way to use it, so we've created like our main thread executor to get back to the main thread, and then we also have like a background thread. And this is a really basic way to do this. And then when we actually want to use this thing, what you'll do is you'll need to have this class available, your executor thing. And you can, have that as like a member variable or a property in your class. And then what you do is you just call exec, which is what I named my executors class, .getBackground.execute. And what's happened here is we've said we want whatever code is in here to execute on a background thread. And then how do we jump back into the main thread? Well, we call executors.getMainThread, and then we execute that, and now we have jumped back onto the main thread. So you do have to deal with the sort of the staircase of concurrency, which people often complain about, but that's what I suggest. You could also, I'm not actually super familiar with the Java Futures and Completables frameworks, but I'm sure those would be a good choice too. So yeah, I do think you should start with that. As far as RxJava versus coroutines, I would say consider RxJava and Kotlin flows to be analogous. It's closer to say that these things are analogous, whereas coroutines don't really operate like RxJava. There's no like inherent need to work with what are they called? Reactive streams, essentially, reactive data streams, which is what you're sort of getting when you're thinking of RxJava or Kotlin flows. Whether or not you should go with RxJava or Kotlin flow is tricky. So we use RxJava at work. I personally, once I got used to flows, I preferred flows when I'm working in a Kotlin code base. There's some things about RxJava, because it's a Java library, which don't really work as seamlessly as flows, particularly around null handling. So if I had the choice where I got to pick my tech stack, it was Kotlin, and I had to pick either RxJava or Kotlin flows, I would pick Kotlin flows. I still think RxJava is a great tool. It's pretty complicated, so hopefully you'll have like a senior developer who can explain it to you or something like that. If I was working in a Java code base, I would definitely do RxJava. But I don't think there's a need to learn both of them unless you want to do that so that you will be able to get hired at a company that uses RxJava still. And that is a very valid reason to learn RxJava. So yeah, I think that's pretty well. So as far as the path, Java Executors framework for both Java and Kotlin, I would recommend people start there. Coroutines would be the next step, but only if you're working in Kotlin. And then, all right, so this would be, and by the way, there's no need to follow my recommendation. This is just, what I suggest, but it's not necessarily like, you must do this or it will not make sense. Let's just say flows. So that'd be Java or Kotlin. Or no, well, Rx Java. Let's do it this way. Java / Kotlin. And then for flows, yeah, I definitely recommend that if you're working in Kotlin. So that's, yeah, that would be my suggestion there. All right, next one we got here. Buttrey says flows are easier to read and they give you a scope which is auto-canceled, while RxJava you have to manually cancel your threads. I don't know if that's exactly true. I think I get what you're saying. Yeah, you have to dispose. I think that's broadly true what you're saying, Buttrey, but I think there's situations with, I'm trying to remember now. It's been a little while since I worked in a flows code base. But yeah, that's probably correct. Yeah, initially I didn't like flows very much because I was like, oh god, now I got to learn another version of RxJava, and I actually I ended up liking flows a little bit more. With that being said, the better I get with RxJava, the more I do tend to be like, yeah, this is pretty powerful. What should we and shouldn't we test in an Android app? That's a terrific question, which is full of opinions. Okay, so disclaimer alert. There are about as many answers to this question as there are people answering this question. I'm going to give you my personal opinion here, but understand that you will come across people who will completely disagree with what I'm about to say. And I might completely disagree with what they're about to say. So this is one of those questions which is unfortunately a lot more subjective than it might actually seem to people, because you would think that we would all have a general agreement here. What should we and shouldn't we test in an Android app? This is actually a gigantic question, but I don't have any other questions, so for now, I'll try and answer this. My main priority in an Android code base is to test logic. So what does logic mean? There's kind of two different kinds. There's a number of different kinds of logic, but I kind of break them down into two pieces. There's, for me, computation logic, and there's control logic. So computation logic should hopefully be extensively tested. So computation logic, this is typically the kind of logic which is almost like independent of the platform or the good morning. The platform or the libraries you're using, although take that in a more general sense. So this would be the kind of logic where if I have an Android Kotlin code base and I have a Swift iOS code base solving problems for the same problem domain, the same app or product, the logic will actually look the same, even though the language and platform is different. Computational logic is almost independent of where it exists. So a great example would be if you're building a calculator app, the computation logic would be the actual mathematics that's going on. And then control logic is about the flow of the data and messages, same thing really, data / messages through the application. My general opinion is that computation logic, if at all possible, should be extensively tested. And you might ask the question, what if in order to test this computation logic, I have weird things to mock, like I have the Android platform or a database or something like that. My opinion would be try to pull that logic out into easy to test classes. So some of you might recall, actually no, I'll use a different example. I was going to talk about model view presenter, but that's actually more about control logic. But yeah, try to pull that logic out into classes or functions. Sometimes you can just have top level functions. There's lots of different ways, but try to pull that logic out into something, let's say ... into things which don't have difficult dependencies to mock/fake. And let me pull up an example here. I've used this example quite a lot lately, but I once wrote most of the front end of a programming language that I made up. And one of those classes is called a scanner, which takes in just input source code and turns it into tokens. And because this class doesn't have any difficult dependencies to mock, so I don't have to talk to like the activity class or the Android SDK because it's just like pure Kotlin, then it was really easy for me to write tests for that class. I actually did do test-driven development, so I wrote the test argument before the function, the implementation, and I went through and incrementally proved the correctness of the class using that approach. That was easy to do because of the dependencies. What makes things like Android really difficult when it comes to testing is, suppose you just want to test some computation logic, and in order to get that computation logic tested, for some reason you put it in a fragment or you put it in an activity. Well, guess what? The best you can do is either deploy the application, which takes quite a long time, generally speaking, or you can fake the Android operating system classes or dependencies that it touches. Sometimes that's okay, sometimes it isn't. So that's sort of the main suggestion here is, if you can, pull your computation logic out into classes that are easy to test. Control logic, this one, even myself, I don't have a strong opinion on. One way you could do that is, suppose you had a class like a view model or a presenter or a controller or whatever. You could give that thing a whole bunch of mock classes or fakes, whatever, test doubles, and you could record which of those things it talks to. That's okay. Which of those things it talks to when you call a particular function. Let me see if I can find an example of that. Let's see here. Let's just go to, oops, that's not what I wanted to click. Go to File, Test, give me a test class. Sure, let's do this one. All right, so how that would look is you would create a whole bunch of mocks for all of the dependencies that that class has, and then you would record like the interactions. So you would say verify that this thing was called. Sometimes you can verify what argument it was called with, and that's sort of like testing the control logic. I still think it's useful to do this, but I don't think it's necessarily useful to cover the whole application with these sorts of tests. Let's get to like what you probably shouldn't test. If you have a class which talks to a database directly, or the platform, there's arguably not a lot of value in mocking those things, because when you're mocking something like a database or a network adapter or platform like system services or something like that, what you're saying is, I want to make sure that this thing behaves correctly when you're talking to these sorts of things, but what you're doing is you're having them talk to fake versions which are not guaranteed to behave the same way. So that's why I'm not huge on like writing unit tests for these sorts of things. This is where, like, preferably you or your company would have test databases / servers, like a staging database or something like that. A fake version that is modeled the same way, has like the same schema as the production version, and is the same software, but it is something that you can potentially screw up on and not cause major issues. And then when it comes to system services, you're going to have to deploy the device in order to test that properly to an emulator or a physical device. I'm not big on testing and mocking these sorts of things. You could maybe cover a bit of the control logic doing that, but not really a fan of doing that. So I think those are like the main things that I would suggest for what you should and shouldn't test. Maybe one final thing is, should you go for 100% code coverage? I haven't found a senior developer who works in a really big company who has actually said, yes, we do 100% code coverage. Should you maybe try to do like 80 or 90% code coverage or something like that? Yeah, there's definitely an argument for that, but it depends is really the answer. So if you're writing code which doesn't have difficult dependencies to deal with, then 100% code coverage is generally a good goal. Otherwise, it totally depends. To give you more of a personal opinion, I am not a fan of testing fragments and activities. I'm not a fan of using Espresso. I'm just not a fan of using those libraries. I would rather cover the core logic of the application with a good amount of tests and then actually like test the UI through integration tests, which would mean like deploying to, for example, my fake test server and actually interacting. Sorry, I'm just getting more comfortable here. Actually interacting with the app as a customer would and testing flows that way, which is kind of like manual testing in a sense, except I'm doing it in a very deliberate way. I would rather spend my time doing that than writing a whole bunch of automated UI tests. Now, that's totally a biased opinion. I'm sure there's someone out there who's saying, Ryan, you're an idiot. Actually, automated UI testing is great and it's totally worth all of the infrastructure and time in order to do that. And they might have a totally valid opinion. It's unfortunately what you'll eventually learn about testing, like many other topics in programming, is that there's not actually a lot of broad agreement. Sorry about that. So yeah, that's my opinion there. Any more questions? I feel like I've been rambling a lot about testing lately. Oh, anyways. I'll wait maybe another 30 seconds, and if we don't get any more questions, then I will call it a day. Remember to stay hydrated. Did you add your water bottle? It's in the drying rack. Yep. Oh, we got another. Okay, I'll wait a moment longer then. Well, this is awkward. This is called dead air, and people recommend against it during live shows. But I do this for free, so I don't actually really care. So Motaz, do you actually have another question, or did you just ask someone else to ask another question? All right, well, I'm gonna wait like 10 seconds here. But yeah, anyways, either way, I will most likely do a Q&A again on Wednesday. So if you had more questions, you could ask then. Motaz asks, why most developers hate modularization? Do you mean, when you say modularization, do you mean multi-module Gradle projects? Is that what you're asking, or just modularization in general? Oh, okay. Yeah, so the reason why most developers, particularly senior developers, don't like multi-module Gradle projects is that basically um, it must solve more problems than it creates. And the point where it solves more problems than it creates is probably where you will need an infrastructure engineer. So what do I mean by this? So I, back in like 2017-ish, multi-module, particularly like presentation domain data apps, were all the rage. We were all doing it, even in like tiny calculator apps and stuff like that. And we thought it was super cool. And then eventually we started to be like, well, hold on a minute. Like, particularly with like presentation domain and data, well, if I change the domain layer, then I have to change all the other layers. So that kind of sucks. And then one thing you learn about multi-module is that it can actually be kind of difficult to figure out how to structure the dependencies between the models. So maybe you need like some other, like a core module, and all of a sudden you need a fourth module. And then some people are like, well, no, just do module by feature. And they really got into it. And um, and then eventually we started asking the question to ourselves, what the hell am I doing here? Like, why am I doing this in a note-taking app? Like, this is like really complicated, and it kind of looks cool, and in theory it's like it reduces the compilation times of your application sometimes. So really, here's the thing. If you're working in a large code base, like I'm thinking Pinterest or Uber or a really big like enterprise, and all of a sudden you can attach a dollar value to reducing the Gradle build times for your fleet of developers, your development team, then we're looking at like, okay, we have a monetary incentive to reduce the time that people spend building their Gradle project. Because if it's a gigantic project and it takes like 10 minutes to Gradle build, well, guess what? As an Android developer, you might be running, Gradle build, depending on what problem you're solving, like, I don't know, up to like 50 times a day or something. That's probably on the outer limits, but I'm sure it's happened. So particularly if you're working with Gradle, or sorry, Dagger. So so by breaking things up into modules and doing like that incremental building, you can do things like reduce the compile and build time of the application drastically. You could have a situation where you've got a team devoted to a particular module, and then that team doesn't touch the other person or the other team's modules. There's totally problems that it does solve. It's just I don't see it solving any problems at like a smaller and even mid-sized scale. And so that's my personal opinion why I don't bother with multi-module anymore. If I was working in a company that had, like I say, a huge code base, I'd be totally happy to work with it. But if we're building like just a simple application with, you know, a couple of screens and this and that. It's like, why are you doing this? It's not, this is really what it comes down to. And this this is my motto for everything in programming. Principles, libraries, architectures, approaches, modularization. Does it solve more problems than it creates? Unfortunately, sometimes you need to use it in a project before you learn where that line is. But when it comes to multi-module, the line, in my opinion, is like, if you have like feature specific teams in your application, then now we're starting to talk about the importance of multi-module Gradle projects. Beyond that, it's pretty debatable. All right, thank you so much for watching. I'll be back probably on Wednesday morning around the same time to answer more questions. I'm going to call it a day for now because it looks like things have slowed down, but thank you for joining me for another live stream. I will try to do a lesson next Monday on Twitch, sort of as usual. I think it's a holiday, but that's all right. And then, let's keep this train wreck moving. Hope you all have a good Monday. I got to start working a little bit, so yeah, I'm going to go get ready for that. Goodbye.